Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at Robert Kilwardby. He was born in England around 1215 and had a pretty interesting path. From the bustling philosophical world of Paris, he moved to teaching theology at Oxford. And eventually, he even became Archbishop of Canterbury and a cardinal. It's really quite a journey. But what really gets me as a philosopher is his shift in thinking. From this deep engagement with Aristotle, he kind of moved towards really integrating Augustinian ideas. And that's what I'm really excited to unpack with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just think about how much he wrote. It's remarkable. Logic, grammar, theology, and even natural philosophy. For any philosopher listening, that's a sign of someone who is deeply invested in figuring out, the basic structures of reality, knowledge, all of that. It's something we can appreciate.
Exactly. So what we're going to try and do is really get to the heart of what Kilwardby brought to the table, philosophically speaking, especially the things that still matter to how we think about philosophy today. I know that medieval philosophy can sometimes feel like, well, a bit like walking through a really dense forest, but we're not going to get lost in all the details. Our goal is to bring some clarity, some light to his most important ideas, really understand what made his thinking tick.
And for those who are already familiar with the medieval period, I think you'll find it particularly fascinating how Kilwardby tried to put together those Aristotelian and Augustinian frameworks. He wasn't just cherry-picking ideas. He was actively trying to build a complete and original philosophical system. It's impressive.
Okay, so let's jump right in. And let's start with this idea he had about the soul, this concept of there being a plurality of forms. As philosophers, we often spend a lot of time thinking about consciousness and what makes a person unified. And Kilwardby presents us with this really complex picture. He seems to say that the soul isn't just one simple, solid thing, right?
Right. He really pushes back against that idea of a simple, unified soul. Instead, he puts forward this idea that the human soul is made up of multiple, he calls them potentiae. We can think of them like fundamental capacities or even like different levels of being inside us. And specifically, he identifies these vegetative, sensitive, and intellective forms. So it's not one single form doing all the work of, life, perception, and thought. For Kilwardby, those come from different aspects of the soul, all interconnected.
So that brings up the big question of unity, right? I mean, if we have all these different forms operating within us, what makes a human being one, a single unified individual? That's a pretty central problem in philosophy.
Absolutely. Kilwardby argues that unity and things that are made of different parts doesn't come from simplicity. It comes from the way these essentially different parts relate to each other in an ordered way. For him, complexity and unity aren't opposites. He sees it more like, in the case of the soul, there's this hierarchy. The less complete forms, like the vegetative functions, so things like growth and nourishment, and then the sensitive capacities, our ability to sense and move, these are all kind of directed toward and then perfected by the intellective form. That's our capacity for reason, for understanding. Think of it like different systems, each with their own role, but all working together in one organism.
That's a good way to put it. But the intellective soul, it's not just one among many. It actually organizes and completes the others. If I remember correctly, he uses this really interesting analogy to explain this, something about geometric shapes.
Yes. That's actually a great example of how Kilwardby thought about philosophy. So he compared it to, imagine a quadrangle. It's made of two triangles, right?
Yeah.
Now, add a third triangle to one of its sides, it becomes a pentagon. But here's the important part. Adding that new triangle doesn't destroy the first two. It actually integrates with them. It creates a new, more complex shape, and it still has all the properties of those original triangles, but now it's also got new ones. It's the same with the soul. When the intellective soul is added, it doesn't just get rid of the vegetative and sensitive potentiae, it actually perfects them. And that results in a full human rational soul. So complexity at one level, for Kilwardby, actually makes possible a more complete kind of unity at a higher level.
And then there's the intellective soul itself, its nature, how it connects to the body. This was a big part of his theory. And it really stands out when we think about it compared to things like angels' pure intellect.
Right. Kilwardby really emphasized that the intellective soul isn't tied to any one organ in the body, unlike, say, the vegetative soul in nutrition or the sensitive soul in the senses. He defined it as the perfection of the sensitive body. And he uses this great analogy of a sailor and a ship. So the sailor's main function, just like the intellect's ability to understand, isn't tied to one specific part of the ship. Not in the same way that, like, the engine is. But, and this is important, the union between the sailor and the ship is essential for the sailor to actually do anything with the ship. So even though the intellective soul might seem I don't know, kind of accidental to the body in some ways. The union between them is absolutely fundamental to what it means to be a human intellective soul.
And this is where things get really interesting philosophically. He also said that the intellective soul has this natural desire to be united with a body that can sense. That it actually, and I love this, that it hates being separated. It seems like this is a big difference between the human intellect and these pure spiritual intellects.
Exactly. This is a core idea for him. He called it unibility. It's a defining characteristic of the human intellective soul, what sets it apart from, say, angels. They both have the power of understanding, but the human soul is made for and directed towards union with a body. Kilwardby even says the human soul is born to move and to perfect the body, something that doesn't apply to angels. And this desire to be embodied is also tied to our desire for knowledge. Our knowledge of the material world starts with our senses. So the intellective soul can only reach its full potential through its interaction with the body. This is something that still resonates in philosophy today, this idea of embodied cognition.
I'm curious about how this idea of a plurality of forms fit in with what his contemporaries were saying. I know there was this other big idea floating around, the theory of the unity of forms. And as philosophers, we know these historical debates are really important. So how did Kilwardby understand this opposing view, and what were his objections to it?
Well, Kilwardby understood the theory of the unity of forms, which is often associated with Aquinas, although Kilwardby's take on it was a bit different, as basically saying that in anything made up of parts, there's ultimately only one substantial form. And when this main form is fully realized, it basically absorbs or even corrupts any forms that were there before. It becomes the only thing responsible for everything that heaving does. And Kilwardby had some problems with this. First, he questioned the idea that a perfection, which is what this supervening form is supposed to be, would actually lead to corruption, rather than making what's already there even more perfect. For him, it didn't make sense that the different organs and capacities of a living being could stay truly distinct if they were all, deep down, just the activity of one form acting on prime matter.
That's a really fundamental question about how things are structured. If everything ultimately comes down to one form, how do we account for all the different functions, all the different properties within a single thing?
Right, exactly. His second objection was a bit more about metaphysical simplicity, you might say. But it also brought in some theological points. He felt that reducing everything to just prime matter and the intellective form made it a lot harder to really explain things like transubstantiation, the incarnation, the resurrection. All these doctrines involve complex transformations, the reunion of specific bodily and spiritual elements. He argued that a richer ontological framework was better equipped to deal with these complexities.
It really shows how interconnected philosophy and theology were in the medieval period. Each one influenced and even constrained the other.
Yeah, for sure. And his third objection goes back to a principle we find in Aristotle, that different objects need different powers to grasp them, and different powers imply different forms. So if you say that this single intellective form is responsible for everything, from understanding abstract concepts to digesting food to perceiving the world, well, that violates this principle. Kilwardby saw the theory of the unity of forms as blurring the lines between different kinds of activities and the faculties that do them. And for him, that meant it wasn't as accurate or as satisfying, philosophically speaking.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Kilwardby's ideas about matter and this really interesting concept he had called seminal reasons. Now, he was a big advocate for universal holomorphism. So for the philosophers out there, how did Kilwardby understand the relationship between matter and form?
Kilwardby was all in on universal holomorphism. This is the idea that everything, except for God, is made up of these two fundamental things. Matter, which he called quod est, meaning that which is potential, and form, quo est, which means that which actualizes that potential. And he didn't just apply this to the physical world. For him, it was a basic metaphysical framework.
I know his understanding of matter wasn't like one size fits all. He actually distinguished between different types of prime matter. What was the reasoning behind that?
So he laid out 3 types of prime matter, each with a specific role. First, there's absolute prime matter. This is pure potential. There's absolutely no form in it at all, and this is the foundation for everything else. Then we have bodily prime matter. This is the kind that has received the form of corporeity. So it's got spatial dimensions, extension, and this is what both celestial and terrestrial bodies are made of. And lastly, there's natural or physical prime matter. This is the matter we find in the world around us here on Earth. It's the matter that can take on specific substantial forms and accidental qualities. It gives rise to the elements and everything we encounter in our everyday lives. It's through these distinctions that he explained the different kinds of beings in the universe and how they are actualized to different degrees.
So it's like this layered view where matter becomes more and more defined as it's informed by different forms. And then there's the question of the unity of prime matter itself, which was a big topic of debate back then. What was Kilwardby's position on that?
That's right. The question was, is prime matter in its most basic nature numerically one, the same across all instances, or is it unified in some other way? Kilwardby considered both sides, the arguments for both numerical and analogical unity. And while his earlier work seems open to both possibilities, later on, he leaned more towards the idea that matter is unified analogically, not numerically. That let him keep this idea of a fundamental commonality between all material beings, while still accounting for their distinct individual existence. The key was figuring out how a single underlying principle could be open to, receptive to, so many different forms.
So there's this really interesting idea he had about matter having active potency. As philosophers, we tend to think of matter as passive, just receiving form. What did Kilwardby mean by this active dimension of matter?
Yeah, Kilwardby moves away from this purely passive view of matter. He argued that it actually has an inherent striving, an appetite for form. He called it active potency. And for him, this wasn't just about the ability to receive form, but that there's a kind of incomplete, you could say inchoate, presence of form already within the matter. It's like this natural inclination towards its full actuality. This was really important for him because it allowed him to make a distinction between natural generation, like the way new things come into being through natural processes, and divine creation out of nothing. It also helped explain how elements can change into one another. He suggested that elements have the forms of other elements within them, but in a potential state, so they can transform under the right conditions.
Which leads us to this fascinating Augustinian concept, the idea of seminal reasons. How did Kilwardby incorporate this into his thinking about active matter?
So Kilwardby took this idea from Augustine, these seminal reasons, to explain how the natural world keeps unfolding, but within a framework of divine creation. He saw these reasons as like inherent potentialities or formative principles that God implanted in creation at the very beginning. So while God is the ultimate creator, he doesn't need to intervene every time a new individual or species comes about. These seminal reasons, which were present in the first things God created, act as the internal causes for how things generate and develop naturally. You can see this really clearly in how he understands reproduction. He says the Father transmits matter that already contains these seminal reasons, along with a corporeal spirit that helps actualize the vegetative and sensitive souls in the offspring. It's really a sophisticated way of bringing together divine causality and secondary natural causes.
It's a pretty compelling way to address this philosophical challenge of explaining both the order and the dynamism of the natural world. So, let's move on to Kilwardby's theory of knowledge. Every philosophical system needs to account for how we know things. He had a very detailed view of how we go from experiencing things with our senses to understanding them intellectually. Let's start with how he saw sense perception. What are the key elements in his account?
Kilwardby didn't think sense perception was just passively receiving stimuli from outside. He laid out some conditions that need to be met. First, you have the object that's being perceived. Then you have the sense organ that can receive the impression. Then there's the medium, the thing that carries the information from the object to the sense. And lastly, and this is crucial, the object has to actively issue a species or a likeness of itself. This species is what we actually perceive, the means by which we come to know that external thing. So you could say his theory is a kind of representationalism.
And he went even further, talking about the specific ways these species travel through different media. He acknowledged that things work differently for different senses, like smell, sight, and hearing. What's the philosophical significance of these distinctions?
Kilwardby was very attentive to the details of how sensory information is transmitted. So he said that smell and hearing work through species carried by waves in the air. Sight, which was really important in medieval philosophy, needed light to be present and involved visual species traveling in straight lines from the object to the eye. He also made a subtle distinction between light and color, saying color was the object of sight and light was what made it possible to see, although he thought the intellect was needed to fully separate the two. These details show his attempt to really explain sensory experience in a naturalistic way. He drew on the scientific understanding of his time, and then he integrated it into his broader philosophical framework.
I know he talked about two motions in sensing, an outward and an inward movement. It sounds like this is a key part of how the sensory soul interacts with these species. Can you explain a bit more about this two-stage process?
So Kilwardby described these two movements in the act of sensing, two movements that are distinct but work together. First, you have the outward motion. This is when the sense organ is affected by the sensible species. It's like the object's likeness impressing itself on the relevant sense. And this prepares the organ to receive the specific quality that's being sensed. Then there's the inward motion. This involves the sensory soul actively assimilating itself to that species within the organ. So it's not just receiving passively, the soul is actively shaping its experience. And this is driven by the soul's natural instinct for self-preservation and also its desire for knowledge. And through this process, the sensory soul forms an internal representation, an image of the object.
So, the sensory soul isn't just a blank slate. It actively contributes to shaping how we perceive things. And what did he think about what we're actually perceiving? Is it the external object itself or this internal representation?
Kilwardby was very clear on that point. He said the direct object of perception is the external thing, not the image. The image, whether it's in the sense organ or in the sensory soul, is just how we get to know the object. It's like a vehicle for the representation, but it's not the thing itself. He also stressed the idea that perception is intentional. The soul actively directs its attention to the body and its senses. It uses those senses as tools to gather information about the world, information that's important for survival and for meeting the organism's needs.
And how did Augustine's ideas play into this account of perception, especially when it comes to what causes our sensory experience?
Kilwardby integrated some key Augustinian ideas, especially when it comes to the idea of causality. He agreed with Aristotle that the object is the source of the species that affects the senses, but he said that the object's role is limited to that initial effect on the organ. Following Augustine's hierarchical view of reality, Kilwardby argued that the soul is the main cause of the perception itself. It actively responds to the body being affected by the species, and then it generates the internal images from within itself, using its own power. So for Kilwardby, following Augustine, an incorporeal thing like the soul can't be directly acted upon by a corporeal object. The soul has its own activity. He basically says that the body feels through the active power of the soul. We've talked about perception, those two motions, those species, but what about memory? It's a crucial part of how we learn and know things. How did Kilwardby see memory bridging the gap between sensing and actually understanding something? Memory plays a big role in Kilwardby's theory of knowledge. It acts like a storehouse, both for sensory information and for intellectual content. He said we have a sensory memory, which keeps those images we get from perception. This allows us to recall those images, and it also allows our imagination to work with them. He also said there's a rational memory, which he further divided into inferior and superior. The inferior part deals with sensible things that are kept for the intellect to use. The superior part is where those intelligible species grasped by the intellect are stored. He even compared rational memory to God the Father, who generates understanding like the Son by presenting these intelligible species to the intellect. This shows how active memory is in providing the raw materials for thinking. So let's move on to intellectual cognition itself. Kilwardby, like Aristotle, distinguished between knowing particular things through our senses and what he called scientia, or scientific knowledge. What's the core difference between those two? Well, according to Kilwardby, while sense perception lets us know individual, contingent things, scientia aims at something more universal, necessary, and eternal, or at least incorruptible. He followed Aristotle's posterior analytics here, defining scientia as the knowledge of the conclusion of a demonstrative syllogism. So the conclusion that necessarily follows from true and primary premises. It's not just knowing facts, it's knowing the causes and reasons behind them.
So how do we get from the particularity of sense experience to this universal knowledge that defines science? That's a fundamental question for epistemology.
Kilwardby thought, it starts with our sensory encounters with individual things. Those sensible species we talked about are received and kept in memory. Then, through repeated experiences with similar particulars, we develop what he calls experience, a sort of preliminary understanding of what they have in common. It's not yet a fully formed universal concept. Then, the active intellect steps in. It abstracts the essential likeness, the common nature that underlies all those individual instances. So the universal, in his view, is this intelligible form, this ratio, that explains why all those individual things share those characteristics. It's a process of generalization based on sensory data.
And abstraction itself, how did Kilwardby, working within the scholastic tradition, explain how the agent intellect creates these universal concepts?
He saw abstraction as the specific job of the agent intellect. Using its inherent power, the agent intellect sheds light on the sensible images we get from experience. It separates the universal intelligible aspects from those particular material conditions they come with in sensation. And then it produces these intelligible species, which are deposited in the possible intellect. This is the part of the mind that can receive and understand those abstract concepts. And once it's formed, this universal residing in the possible intellect becomes the object of intellectual understanding. It's that common ratio, the underlying principle that we can then predicate of all the individual things that share that nature.
He also had a particular view on the reality of universals. It's often called moderate realism. Philosophically, what does this position actually entail? Are universals just things in our minds, or do they exist outside of us?
Kilwardby's moderate realism says that universals exist in individual things as their individuated forms. So the form of humanity exists in Peter and in Paul, but as numerically distinct instances tied to their individual matter. It's not like there's one separate humanity floating around out there. But these individual forms, they share an essential likeness, a common nature. And it's only through abstraction, through the work of the intellect, that this common nature is considered universally as a universal concept. So the universal, as such, formally exists in the intellect. But it's rooted in real similarities between things in the world. It's like a middle ground between the Platonic forms, which exist independently, and nominalism, where universals are just names.
Moving on to how Kilwardby thought about truth. He considered it an equivocal notion. So, for our philosopher listeners, what are the different ways we can talk about truth, according to Kilwardby?
Well, for Kilwardby, truth wasn't just one thing with one meaning. In one sense, thinking more ontologically, truth referred to the very being or essence of a thing, its quiddity, what it fundamentally is. He also used the classic Avicennian definition, where truth is the correspondence between a thing and an intellect, adequatio rei et intellectus. But he emphasized that truth and falsity, in the strictest sense, are really about how we put together and divide concepts in our minds, in our judgments and propositions. It's not so much in things outside of us. Our thoughts, our statements are true when they accurately reflect how things really are.
So, a proposition is true when it matches the state of affairs in the world. That's the classic correspondence theory. But what about when we talk about things that don't actually exist, like mythical creatures? What did Kilwardby say about truth in those cases?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the nuance of his view. So he argued that even statements about things that don't exist, like a chimera, can still be meaningful, and we can still think about them in relation to truth in a certain way. The term chimera still means something in language and in the mind of someone who's thinking about it, even if it doesn't refer to a real thing. So the definition of a chimera can be accurate, even though the thing itself doesn't exist. He also pointed out that the truth of some propositions, especially those that express necessary relationships or definitions like a human is an animal or an eclipse is the privation of light, those don't depend on whether the things they're talking about actually exist at that moment. They're true based on the essential natures involved.
Now, Kilwardby also had a system for classifying different kinds of signs. As philosophers, we're always interested in semiotics, the theory of meaning. So what were the main distinctions he made?
Well, he had this broad categorization of signs. First, there were natural signs. This is where the connection between the sign and what it signifies is built in or causal, like smoke naturally indicating fire. And then there were conventional signs or given signs. Here, the connection is established by agreement or imposition. And he further divided those given signs into those that resemble what they signify, like a painted portrait, or, importantly, spoken words representing thoughts, and those that don't. And then, within the signs that do have a likeness, he made another distinction, those that primarily signify something else, like words signifying concepts, and those that can also signify invisible realities through resemblance, like sacraments in theology. This whole classification system shows his effort to systematically understand the different ways we use signs to make sense of the world.
And he emphasized the conventional nature of language, of spoken words. What are the philosophical implications of that? How does that affect how we think about linguistic meaning?
Yeah. Kilwardby was firm in his belief that most words signify by convention, what he called ad placitum. The fact that different languages use completely different sounds for the same things was key evidence for him. There's an arbitrary connection between sound and meaning. But he did recognize that there are natural signs in language, too, like the sounds animals make instinctively. But for those conventional signs, he highlighted the original voluntary act of giving a significatum, a meaning or concept, to a particular sound. And importantly, he argued that spoken words primarily and directly signify the passio animi, the mental affection or concept in the speaker's mind, and only indirectly do they signify external things through these internal thoughts. So this aligns with the idea that meaning in language ultimately comes from the mental content it expresses.
And I know he had this interesting argument that only humans can produce truly meaningful utterances because we have reason. What's the philosophical basis for that?
So, building on the work of the linguist Pridgen, Kilwardby argued that truly meaningful, articulate speech, the kind humans produce, is inherently tied to a sensus mentis, or intellectus, in the speaker's mind. Only beings with a rational intellect can form concepts and intentionally communicate them through language. He also said that to modulate sounds precisely and consistently, which you need for language, the sensory soul has to be directed by the rational soul. This really highlights how our cognitive faculties and our expressive faculties are integrated. He also made this distinction between the nota aspect of speech for the speaker, the intended meaning they're conveying, and the signum aspect for the listener, the physical sound that's the signifier. This distinction points to the intention to communicate, which is built into human language.
Okay, let's focus now on logic and demonstrative science. Kilwardby adopted these distinctions that Robert Grosseteste made about what it means to know. Can you break down the key philosophical differences between these different senses of knowledge?
Sure. Kilwardby took this framework from Grosseteste, where he outlines 4 different senses of to know, or scire, in Latin. It starts with a basic awareness of facts, things that just happen to be true, and moves towards a deeper understanding of necessary truths. So first you have understanding that things are true contingently, that they just happen to be that way. Then there's knowing truths that hold generally, but not necessarily. Then knowing immutable truths. And finally, and this is the most rigorous kind of knowledge, understanding the truth of things that are eternally and necessarily the same. And we know these through their causes, or through prior knowledge. This last category is what Aristotle called demonstrative conclusions. So Kilwardby emphasized that while our senses give us a familiarity with the world, the most complete, philosophically significant kind of knowledge is found in the realm of universals and necessary truths, especially those established through demonstration.
And these demonstrations, which are central to scientific knowledge for Aristotle and everyone who followed him, they rely on first principles. Where did Kilwardby think we get these fundamental truths? Are they innate, or do they come from experience?
Kilwardby absolutely rejected the idea that the first principles of demonstration are innate or that we can demonstrate them. He said we acquire them through a process that starts with sensory experience. His reasoning was that to understand a proposition, you first have to understand the terms in it. And through abstracting from sensory data, our intellects grasp those universal concepts that function as the subjects and predicates in our judgments. And it's from clearly understanding those universal concepts and the relationships between them that we come to recognize the self-evident truth of the first principles.
And how do we become certain about those first principles if they're not proven themselves? I know he talked about the light of truth. How does that fit into his epistemology?
Kilwardby said that the certainty we have about those self-evident first principles comes from what he called the light of truth. He believed that this is an inherent power of the intellect, this ability to recognize truth when it's presented clearly. And it's this same intellectual illumination that allows us to both understand the terms in a first principle and immediately assent to its truth because we understand those terms. This light also helps us to see the necessary connection between the premises and the conclusion in a valid demonstration, so we're compelled to assent to the demonstrated knowledge. He even compared the middle term in a syllogism to light. Just like light makes physical vision possible, this middle term allows us to see the causal connection, the logical flow from premises to conclusion.
So for Kilwardby, as for Aristotle, demonstrative science isn't just about having true premises. They also have to be necessary in a specific way. What kind of necessity did he have in mind?
He was very clear that for a demonstration to give us genuine scientific knowledge, the premises can't just be true, they have to be necessary. You can't get a necessary conclusion from contingent premises. And the kind of universality we need here goes beyond just being true in many cases. It has to be true in all instances that fall under the subject at all times, and primarily, essentially, de quodlibet et impera primo, as he put it. The kind of necessity he's talking about is rooted in the very nature, the essence of the thing being considered. It applies to everything that falls under that category because of what it is, making it inherently universal and unchanging.
And where does logic fit into all of this? He famously called it the modus scientiarum, the science of sciences. What did he mean by that?
He saw logic as the science that uncovers and teaches the method, the art, of moving from things we know to investigating the unknown. And we do this by using correct reasoning. He argued that it's not the same as metaphysics. Metaphysics deals with being in its most general sense, which is often immaterial. Logical reasoning, especially in the form of a syllogism, is more like an intellectual movement. We infer properties from a subject, we draw conclusions from premises. As the science of sciences, logic gives us those basic principles and rules of valid inference, and we can apply those rules across all the different sciences. So it's a vital tool for pursuing and organizing knowledge, no matter what you're studying. It teaches us how to define terms, how to make propositions, and how to build valid arguments.
And I know he introduced these terms, first intentions and second intentions, in the context of logic. Can you explain that distinction? Why is it so important for understanding what logic is all about?
Sure, it's a fundamental distinction. So when we consider things according to first intentions, we're considering them as they exist in themselves, within the 10 categories of being, things like substance, quantity, quality, and so on. Second intentions are the ways our intellects reflect on those first intentions and how it relates them to one another. We have to have concepts of things themselves before we can have concepts about those concepts and their relationships. So a term like human or white, those refer to first intentions. Terms like universal, particular, genus, species, those are second intentions. And Kilwardby saw logic as primarily dealing with these second intentions. He called them the rationes rerum, the formal structures, the modes by which we reason about things. It's not so much about the specific content, the nature of the things themselves. The logician is focused on whether arguments are formally valid, on the relationships between concepts as concepts, not so much the particular things those concepts refer to.
So logic gives us these abstract tools, this structural framework for sound reasoning, and then we can take those tools and apply them to the specific subject matter of any science. That's what makes it the science of sciences.
Let's talk about his classification of the sciences, laid out in his work De Ortu Scientiarum. It was heavily influenced by Hugh of St. Victor, right?
It was, yeah. His classification of the sciences in De Ortu Scientiarum owes a lot to Hugh of St. Victor's De Didascalicon. But Kilwardby went beyond that. He systematized the approach, and he brought in some Aristotelian principles for how we define and organize scientific disciplines. He was very clear about what makes a true science in the Aristotelian sense. You need a clearly defined subject matter, you need to systematically present its parts and properties, and you need to ground all of that in first principles, both common ones and those specific to the subject matter.
And he talked about a modus scientia, a method for doing science, and it involved defining, dividing, and collecting. What did each of those steps entail? So this modus scientia is all about systematically investigating the properties of a science's subject matter, the things we can prove are true about it. It starts with definition, which is about clarifying what the subject is, its essence, its boundaries, and that includes defining its parts and species. Then you have division. This is where you break down the subject into its different categories so you can understand its internal structure comprehensively. And finally, there's collection, or reasoning. This is where you bring those definitions and divisions together to establish the properties of the subject and its parts. And you often do this through demonstrative arguments.
There's this interesting philosophical question he addressed. Can metaphysics legitimately study both God and creatures without violating the idea that a science should have unity? How did he resolve that?
So he argued that metaphysics, which he saw as the science of being as being, can include both God and creatures as its objects without losing its essential unity. And the reason is analogy. Terms like being, substance, cause, they don't apply to God and creatures in exactly the same way. But they're not completely different either. They're predicated analogously. So there's a proportional similarity in their meaning. The primary, most perfect application is to God as the uncaused first being. But they also apply, secondarily, to creatures, because they get their existence from God. He also pointed out that our knowledge of God in metaphysics isn't direct. We,